During this episode, we will investigate more unsolved crimes which have taken place at the time when one year transitions into another. Tragic occurrences in which the families of those involved learn that the coming of the new year has heralded nothing but tragedy. At the turn of the 20th century, the main source of revenue in the US state of Michigan was its rich deposits of copper ore. Miners and workers would travel to the region from all over the world in search of employment, and so widespread was this industry in the Great Lakes state that within just a short space of time, no other place on Earth could match its volume of copper production. A multitude of businesses had soon sprung up to sustain the work, the largest of which was the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. For over half a century, it would remain a major player in American industry, producing 45,000 metric tons of copper per year at its peak. The company's owners had always prided themselves on the level of support provided for their labourers, building hospitals, schools, and libraries for the families of the workers. They were perhaps understandably aggrieved then, when all of their mines halted production in 1913 as a result of a national strike called by the Western Federation of Miners. By the onset of the Christmas period, this walkout had been running for 5 months, with tempers on both sides of the divide running high. In an effort to stiffen the resolve of their members, local representatives of the Miners' Union decided to organise a Christmas party for them and their families. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, 500 children accompanied by a further 200 adults packed into the second floor of the Italian Hall in the town of Calumet. But hardly had the assembled throng settled down to listen to the speeches of their hosts when someone at the rear of the hall was heard to cry out that there was a fire. With desperate parents seizing their children and hurrying for the room's only exit, it took no time at all for utter panic to take hold. Amidst the screams and wails, the desperate throng began to surge down the stairs, only to discover that the 2 grape stores which led out onto the main street were closed. In addition to the people who had already fallen and been trampled underfoot, those pressed up against the wooden panels at the front of the crowd also succumbed to the crush. Rescuers would later recover the bodies of 73 people who had been killed during the horrific stampede, 59 of which were children. As it quickly became apparent that there had never been any fire, accusations flourished that a company representative had cried out the warning in order to disrupt proceedings. Multiple people claimed that a stranger wearing an anti-union logo had been the one to enter the room before shouting the fake warning and then fleeing the scene. Unsurprisingly, the company was quick to respond to the accusation and moved to cast doubt on the testimony of the attendees. Many of those involved did not speak English as a first language, and the fact they had been questioned without interpreters was a point of great argument during the subsequent inquest. A $25,000 fund offered to the victims was snubbed, and was followed by accusations of harassment and intimidation of the witnesses and their families. So violent and aggressive were the interactions between the 2 sides in court that the coroner eventually ruled that no definitive cause for the tragedy could be found. In the years that have passed, no person has ever been identified in causing the crush, or the question been answered as to why the doors had failed to open, further increasing fatalities. As a result, the Italian Hall incident continues to prove divisive over a century later, with some commentators calling it the Calumet tragedy and others referring to it as the Calumet Massacre. During the summer of 1950, the Immo family moved into the suburbs of the Finnish city of Kemi, a far cry from their small hometown on the Swedish border. This decision had been made due to the death of the family patriarch, a police constable who had survived the horrors of World War II, only to pass away several years later. For the 5 children of the Immo household, the hustle and bustle of life in their new surroundings was a world away from the simplistic rural existence they had left behind. But in contrast to the worries and fears of her 4 younger brothers, for 15-year-old Ellie Immo, the move represented a fantastic and exciting opportunity. Enrolling in the city's School of Economics, she went on to make many friends, taking on a part-time job to fund her newfound social freedom. On the evening of Wednesday, December the 7th, 1955, with her mother at work and her brothers at a Christmas party, Ellie had grown bored of being home alone. But shortly before 7 p.m, the tedium had been broken by the arrival of one of her friends, Maria, who had also been at a loose end. Deciding to call for a third friend named Annalisa, the trio then made their way into the city centre to watch a movie. After discovering that there was nothing of interest to watch at the theatre, the 3 girls spent their time moving through various shops and cafes before deciding to call it a night. With Annalisa having headed off on her own, the remaining pair had walked together until they disagreed about the best route home. They would part company at around 9:30 p.m, having walked together as far as Lapatine Road, which was roughly 100 metres from the Immo house. It was a journey she had taken on numerous occasions before, along a small footpath which ran across a local railway line, but this evening she would fail to complete it. The following afternoon, a schoolboy happened across Ellie's remains, half hidden by snow, just off the footpath she had last been seen on. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the face, throat and torso, with wounds on her hands indicating she had tried to prevent the attack. The killer had then attempted to bury her body in the snow, before it was further covered over by snowfall during the night. Unprepared to investigate a crime of this magnitude, the local police soon found themselves with more questions than answers. An autopsy revealed the dead woman had not been sexually assaulted, and all her monies and personal effects were still on her person. Although footprints and tyre marks were found in the snow next to Ellie's body, no murder weapon could be located. But perhaps the most inexplicable and infuriating aspect for officers investigating the case was the extremely tight time frame of the crime. Police spoke to a number of people who had used the path in the minutes both before and after Ellie had been seen to walk along it. This included her brothers, who had travelled home this way less than half an hour later, and 2 lodgers who also resided in the same building. The killer would only have had a matter of minutes to carry out the murder, hide the body, and then flee the scene, apparently undetected by any other person. Inquiries into Ellie's private life did little to uncover a motive for the murder, seeming to indicate it had been a random attack. She had returned from a dance in a neighbouring town the previous evening, mentioning one particular boy she had danced with, and there had been an issue at school with another boy who had been defrauding his fellow students, but neither of these lines of inquiry would produce a suspect. In total, over 60 people would be questioned in relation to the killing, including a man believed to be one of Finland's few serial killers. In 1959, officers interviewed Erik Runar Holmström in relation to the death, whilst he was awaiting trial for the murder of 3 other women. The killer denied the offences and would go on to commit suicide the following year, with his own crimes soon forgotten in the aftermath of the infamous Lake Bodom killings. To this day, it remains a mystery as to why the 19-year-old student was killed only meters away from the safety of her home. Was the killer someone she had known, familiar with her movements and lying in wait? Or was she simply the only person they could find as they roamed the streets in search of a random victim? On the 31st of December 1997, 21-year-old Ben Smart and 17-year-old Olivia Hope had made their way to New Zealand's Marlborough Sounds to see in the new year. Following their arrival, they mingled with the many other partygoers who had travelled to the location, moving around the various parties and functions that were taking place. But as the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that there were few places they would be able to sleep once the festivities were over. At 4 AM, having been turned away from a yacht they had hoped to stay on, the pair were seated in a water taxi when another passenger had offered to let them stay on his boat. Shortly after this, having been ferried across to one of the many vessels moored up in the harbour, they disembarked with their new acquaintance. It would be the last time they were ever seen again, and 2 days later, the 2 friends were formally reported missing by their families. The subsequent investigation into the disappearance was both swift and aggressive. In no time at all, the attention of the investigating officers had been drawn to a sloop lying in the harbour named Blade. The boat's owner, a convicted criminal named Scott Watson, was questioned extensively based on his alleged movements on the night the pair had disappeared. Despite his protestations, 6 months later, Watson was arrested and formally charged with the murder of the missing travellers. Presenting their case at court, prosecutors appeared confident that the man in the dock had abducted and killed Olivia Hope and Ben Smart. And sure enough, on the 11th of September 1999, Scott Watson was found guilty of the killings after an 11-week trial. But despite nearly 500 witness statements, recordings of Watson's phone calls after the event, and forensic evidence, grave doubts about the conviction immediately arose. Several of those involved claimed that their testimony had either been ignored or had been altered by the officers to suit their own narrative against Watson. Witness descriptions of both the mystery passenger and his ketch proved markedly different to the images of Watson and his yacht. With no bodies ever found, and allegations that 2 blonde hairs recovered from his boat did not match the DNA profile of Olivia Hope, the bulk of the evidence appeared highly circumstantial. Having turned Watson's ex-partner against him, the police had attempted to elicit a confession during the recordings of their phone calls, but ultimately failed to do so. There were claims that officers had deliberately ignored lines of inquiry which led away from Watson and planted stories in the media regarding his past life and crimes. In reality, the majority of his convictions pertain to theft or drug offences, with none having been committed during a period of 8 years before the incident. In the decades since the trial, Watson has made repeated appeals against his conviction, and is now supported in these by Gerald Hope, Olivia's father. It remains possible that given the issues with the evidence presented by the police, it may indeed have been somebody else who perpetrated this alleged crime. At the same time, with no tangible evidence that the 2 were killed, it is also conceivable that some other unknown event led to their disappearance. With the extensive interest around this controversial case, it seems probable that further evidence may yet remain which could come to light at a future time. Whether this leads to the bodies of the missing friends or the freedom of Scott Watson remains to be seen. In previous episodes, we have touched upon the high number of Indigenous people who have passed away under mysterious or inexplicable circumstances in the North American continent. One of the most infamous examples involves the small city of Nome, where a significant number of local residents have disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving no trace as to what fate may have befallen them. Studies by agencies and organisations have suggested that members of the native population are disproportionately more likely to be harmed or killed when compared to other ethnic groups. This data also evidences that in a fifth of such cases, no suspect is ever identified by the police when they attempt to investigate the circumstances surrounding the death. It is an issue that remains very much in the public eye, with years of campaigning having recently resulted in a presidential task force being created to investigate the problem. At the conclusion of many of these inquiries, there remains far more questions than answers for the families of the deceased. A prime example concerns the fate of 38-year-old Tabitha Kalloch, who was found deceased in her home on Christmas Day 2002. On the morning in question, Tabitha's daughter Tracy became apprehensive when she was unable to get hold of her mother on the telephone. As a result, the teenager had hurried across their hometown of Resolute Bay in Nunavut towards her mother's address. Upon entering the premises, she had tragically discovered her mother lying on the floor deceased, with no obvious or apparent cause for her death. The subsequent police investigation quickly determined that there were suspicious circumstances at play, as her passing had not occurred as a result of a natural medical issue. Instead, the autopsy identified traces of two fatal substances that had somehow made their way into Tabitha's bloodstream, these being antifreeze and battery acid. With the police having informed them that the death would be treated as a homicide, the family had waited for updates, only to be told several weeks later that the case had instead been re-evaluated. Despite accepting that no signs of preparation or suicidal ideology had been found at the address, the investigating officers now believed that with no other lines of inquiry to follow, suicide was now a more likely explanation. Tabitha's children maintained that their mother was very much against the idea of suicide and had always raised them to live their lives in an ordered and proper manner. She had also planned to attend social events with them in the days and weeks that lay ahead, with no suggestion of any reason or motive for her to take her own life. Tabitha's death, like many others, remains open to investigation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It is hoped that as public pressure on the issue of Indigenous citizens dying in mysterious circumstances continues, that her case might be revisited and closure finally found for her family. If the stories we have examined over these episodes demonstrate anything, it is that for a significant proportion of humanity, the arrival of Christmas and New Year has little impact on their darker instincts and impulses. If anything, it seems the busy nature of the holidays only makes it easier for such criminals to go about their business, their actions going unseen amidst the festive hustle and bustle. There remains just as many motiveless murders and unsolved crimes during the weeks leading up to Christmas and continuing into the New Year as any other period. So as a society, we should perhaps seek to have sympathy and offer additional support to those amongst our number affected by such tragic events, lest we should ever be affected by a similar sorrow.